At 14:18 hours on May 2nd, 1842, Commander Hugh Faulkner stood on the bridge of HMS Edinburgh watching two white torpedo wakes racing toward his ship from 3,000 yards. The torpedoes were fired by German submarine U-456, which had been stalking Edinburgh for the past hour waiting for the optimal firing position. Edinburgh was a town-class light cruiser sister ship to HMS Belfast, displacing 11,550 tons and armed with 12 6-inch guns. She was escorting convoy QP-11, a return convoy from Murmansk to Britain consisting of 13 merchant ships carrying vital supplies. But Edinburgh was carrying something far more valuable than the merchant ship's cargo. Locked in her forward magazine beneath tons of armor plate and sealed behind steel doors were 465 ingots of Soviet gold, 0.5 tons weighing approximately 45 million, 1942 dollars, over 750 million today. The gold was payment from the Soviet Union to Britain for war supplies delivered under Lend-Lease. It was being transported to Britain to replenish British gold reserves depleted by 3 years of war. Faulkner had 2 seconds to react before the torpedoes struck. He ordered hard to starboard, attempting to turn Edinburgh's bow toward the torpedoes to minimize target profile. Edinburgh began her turn. The first torpedo struck Edinburgh's stern on the port side at 14:18 hours and 10 seconds. The explosion tore a 40-foot hole in the hull, destroying Edinburgh's steering gear, both propeller shafts and the entire stern structure aft of the aft turrets. The stern section, approximately 60 feet of the ship, was blown off, completely separating from the main hull and sinking immediately. Edinburgh's stern was gone. The ship could not steer. She could not maneuver. She was dead in the water, drifting at the mercy of the Arctic currents. The second torpedo struck 5 seconds later, hitting the bow on the starboard side. The explosion blew another 40-foot hole in the forward hull, destroying Edinburgh's forward magazine, the compartment that contained 4.5 tons of Soviet gold. Water flooded into the magazine immediately. The gold, stored in wooden crates, sank to the bottom of the flooded compartment. Edinburgh was now missing both her bow and her stern. 2 massive holes flooding uncontrollably, drifting in Arctic waters 200 miles from Murmansk, carrying 45 million in gold that was sinking deeper into her flooded hull with every passing minute. Over the next 3 days, Edinburgh's crew would fight desperately to save their ship and the gold. They would succeed in neither. Edinburgh would sink on May 2, 1942, taking the gold with her to the bottom of the Barents Sea in 800 feet of water. And the reason she sank so quickly, the reason damage control could not save her, was a design flaw that had been identified during her construction in 1938 and never corrected. HMS Edinburgh had no torpedo bulges, no underwater protection system, nothing to absorb torpedo explosions except her thin hull plating. HMS Edinburgh was a town-class light cruiser, the second ship of the Edinburgh subclass, consisting of Edinburgh and Belfast. Edinburgh was laid down at Swan Hunter Shipyard in Wallsend on December 30, 1936, the same month as Belfast. The town class was Britain's response to the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which limited cruiser displacement to 10,000 tons and gun caliber to 6.1 inches. Britain needed modern cruisers to protect its global trade routes and support the fleet. The town class pushed treaty limits, displacing 11,550 tons standard, approximately 13,175 tons, fully loaded with a length of 613 feet, beam of 63.3 feet, and draft of 17.3 feet. Main armament consisted of 12 6-inch Mark .3 guns in 4 triple turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Secondary armament consisted of 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mounts. Anti-aircraft armament included 16 2-pounder pom-pom guns in 2 octuple mounts and numerous smaller machine guns. Propulsion consisted of 4 Admiralty 3-drum boilers feeding 4 Parsons geared turbines generating 80,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 screws. Maximum speed was 32.5 knots. Range was 8,000 nautical miles at 13 knots. Armor protection was modest: 4.5-inch belt, 3-inch deck over magazines, 4-inch turret faces, 4-inch conning tower. The armor was sufficient to defeat destroyer guns and shell splinters, but inadequate against heavy cruiser or capital ship guns. The critical design flaw was Edinburgh's lack of underwater protection. Modern warships in 1938 incorporated torpedo protection systems, layers of void spaces, fuel tanks and compartments designed to absorb torpedo explosions and prevent flooding from reaching vital spaces. These systems added weight and complexity, but were considered essential after World War I demonstrated that torpedoes could sink capital ships. British capital ships built in the 1930s, like the King George V-class battleships, had comprehensive torpedo protection systems, consisting of multiple bulkheads, crushable tubes, and void spaces that could absorb explosions from torpedoes carrying up to 750-pound warheads. American cruisers built in the 1930s incorporated similar systems. Japanese cruisers had torpedo bulges, external blisters added to the hull to absorb torpedo impacts. The Town-class cruisers had none of this. The designers chose to maximize gun armament and speed at the expense of underwater protection. Adding torpedo bulges would have increased displacement beyond treaty limits, reduced speed, and decreased range. Adding internal torpedo protection would have reduced internal volume, limiting magazine capacity and machinery space. The designers calculated that cruisers would operate with destroyer escorts that would screen against submarine and torpedo attacks. Cruisers would rarely be exposed to torpedo attack without warning. The risk was considered acceptable given the performance benefits of eliminating torpedo protection. This calculation was questioned during Edinburgh's construction. In 1937, while Edinburgh was being built, several Royal Navy officers, including Commander Charles Hughes Hallett, submitted reports to the Admiralty, noting that the Town-class design was vulnerable to torpedo attack. Hughes Hallett specifically noted that a single torpedo hit amidships would likely flood multiple compartments, crippling propulsion and steering. 2 torpedo hits would likely sink the ship. He recommended retrofitting torpedo bulges during construction or redesigning the class. The Admiralty reviewed the recommendations and rejected them. The reasons were financial and strategic. Retrofitting torpedo bulges would delay construction by months and increase costs by approximately 10%. Britain needed cruisers immediately to replace aging vessels. Delaying Town-class construction to add torpedo protection was unacceptable. The Admiralty accepted the vulnerability as the price for rapid construction and high performance. Edinburgh was launched on March 31, 1938, and commissioned on July 6, 1939, 2 months before Britain declared war on Germany. Her early war service was uneventful, consisting of convoy escort duties in the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea. In November 1939, Edinburgh participated in the blockade of Germany, patrolling the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland to intercept German merchant ships and naval vessels attempting to break out into the Atlantic. In April 1940, during the German invasion of Norway, Edinburgh supported British forces evacuating from Namsos, providing anti-aircraft defense and shore bombardment. In May 1940, Edinburgh was torpedoed by German submarine U-25 off the Norwegian coast. The torpedo struck amidships on the starboard side, flooding 2 compartments and killing 8 men. Edinburgh returned to Britain for repairs that took 2 months. The damage was severe but not catastrophic because the torpedo had struck a glancing blow rather than a direct perpendicular hit. The incident demonstrated the vulnerability that Hughes Hallett had warned about, but no modifications were made to improve torpedo protection. In 1941, Edinburgh was assigned to convoy escort duties in the Arctic, protecting convoys carrying supplies from Britain to the Soviet Union. The Arctic convoys were among the most dangerous naval operations of World War II. Convoys faced German U-boats operating from bases in Norway, Luftwaffe bombers from Norwegian airfields, and the threat of German surface raiders like battleship Tirpitz and cruiser Admiral Hipper. Weather was brutal, with storms, ice, and darkness lasting 20 hours per day during winter. Edinburgh conducted multiple convoy escort missions between 1941 and early 1942, protecting convoys PQ and QP series, traveling to and from Murmansk and Archangel. By April 1942, Edinburgh was an experienced Arctic convoy escort. Her crew knew the dangers. They knew German U-boats stalked every convoy. They knew torpedoes were the primary threat. They also knew Edinburgh had no torpedo protection. That knowledge created constant anxiety. Any torpedo hit could be fatal. On April 21, 1942, Edinburgh departed Scapa Flow, Britain's main naval base in the Orkney Islands, as escort for convoy QP-11. The convoy consisted of 13 merchant ships returning from Murmansk to Britain. Edinburgh's mission was to escort the convoy through the most dangerous portion of the route, the waters north of Norway, where German forces were concentrated. Edinburgh was not alone. She was accompanied by 4 destroyers and 3 smaller escort vessels. The convoy departed Murmansk on April 28, 1942, steaming west toward Iceland. But Edinburgh was carrying unusual cargo. Before departing Murmansk, Edinburgh had been loaded with 465 gold ingots provided by the Soviet government. The gold weighed approximately 4.5 tons, valued at $45 million in 1942. Each ingot weighed approximately 28 pounds, a standard gold bar size. The 465 ingots were packed in wooden crates and stored in Edinburgh's forward magazine, a compartment below the waterline protected by armor plate. The gold was payment for British war supplies delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union, despite being Britain's ally, insisted on paying for supplies rather than accepting them as gifts. Soviet pride demanded payment. Gold was the only currency acceptable to Britain. Paper currency was worthless for international transactions. The Soviets shipped gold from reserves accumulated during the 1930s. This shipment was one of several sent from 1941 to 1945. The total gold sent from the Soviet Union to Britain during the war exceeded 50 tons, worth over $500 million. The gold was essential for Britain. By 1942, British gold reserves were depleted by 3 years of war. Britain was purchasing supplies from neutral countries, particularly the United States, before America entered the war. Those purchases required payment in gold. Soviet gold replenished British reserves and allowed continued purchases. Edinburgh's crew was not informed about the gold. Only Captain Faulkner and a few senior officers knew. The crew knew they were carrying something valuable because Marines guarded the forward magazine and entry was prohibited. But they assumed it was sensitive documents or cryptographic equipment. The actual cargo was more valuable than most crew members earned in their entire lives. At 1,000 hours on May 1, 1942, while Edinburgh and convoy QP-11 were approximately 250 miles northeast of Murmansk, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy. The aircraft shadowed from a distance, reporting position and course to German naval headquarters in Norway. At 1400 hours on May 1st, 3 German submarines were vectored to intercept U-456, U-88, and U-674. All 3 submarines positioned along the convoy's expected track. At 0800 hours on May 2nd, U-456, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert, spotted the convoy through his periscope. Teichert maneuvered U-456 into attack position, targeting the largest warship, HMS Edinburgh. Teichert waited until Edinburgh was within 3,000 yards, then fired 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern. 2 torpedoes missed. 2 torpedoes hit. The first torpedo struck Edinburgh's stern at 14 to 18 hours, blowing off the entire stern section. The second torpedo struck the bow 5 seconds later, blowing a massive hole in the forward hull. Edinburgh's damage was catastrophic. Her stern was gone. Her bow was flooded. She had no steering. She had minimal propulsion because both propeller shafts were destroyed. She was drifting in Arctic waters with 2 massive holes letting in thousands of tons of water. Captain Faulkner assessed the situation immediately. Edinburgh was mortally wounded, but not sinking immediately. The torpedo hits had flooded compartments at both ends, but the midship section containing the machinery spaces was intact. If damage control parties could seal the flooded compartments and control flooding, Edinburgh might survive long enough to be towed to port. Faulkner ordered all watertight doors closed and damage control parties to shore bulkheads and pump water. The crew responded heroically. Damage control parties sealed off the flooded bow and stern sections, closing watertight doors and shoring bulkheads with timbers. Pumps were activated to remove water from flooded compartments, but the flooding was overwhelming. Water was entering faster than pumps could remove it. The bow section was flooding uncontrollably. The stern section no longer existed. Edinburgh was settling lower in the water. At 14:45 hours, Faulkner radioed his situation to the convoy commander. Edinburgh was crippled, unable to maneuver, requiring assistance. The convoy commander ordered 2 destroyers, HMS Foresight and HMS Forester, to stand by Edinburgh and prepare to take her under tow. The rest of the convoy continued west, escorted by the remaining destroyers. Edinburgh could not keep up. She would have to be towed separately. At 1600 hours, Foresight attempted to take Edinburgh under tow. A tow line was passed from Foresight to Edinburgh's bow. The tow began at 5 knots an agonizingly slow pace. Edinburgh's flooded bow created enormous drag. The tow line stretched under the strain. At 1630 hours, the tow line parted. A second attempt was made at 1700 hours with a heavier line. The tow proceeded for 3 hours until 2000 hours when the line parted again. Edinburgh's bow was so damaged and flooded that securing a tow line was nearly impossible. Through the night of May 2nd to 3rd, Edinburgh drifted, while repairs were attempted. Damage control parties worked continuously, sealing compartments, shoring bulkheads, pumping water. The weather deteriorated, seas increased to 8 feet. Edinburgh rolled heavily, putting additional stress on her damaged structure. Water continued flooding into the bow and stern sections. By dawn on May 3rd, Edinburgh had drifted approximately 30 miles northwest further from safety. At 0600 hours on May 3rd, German reconnaissance aircraft relocated Edinburgh. The aircraft reported her position to German naval forces in Norway. At 0800 hours, 3 German destroyers, Z-7, Hermann Schumann, Z-24, and Z-25 were dispatched to finish Edinburgh. The destroyers were modern, fast, heavily armed, capable of destroying a crippled cruiser. At 0630 hours, Foresight's radar detected surface contacts approaching from the south at high speed. Range was 25,000 yards. The contacts were identified as German destroyers. Faulkner assessed the situation. Edinburgh was crippled, unable to maneuver, barely afloat. Her main battery was operational, but her fire control buoy was degraded by damage. She could fight, but not effectively. The 2 British destroyers escorting her, Foresight and Forester, were outgunned by 3 German destroyers, but they had no choice. If they withdrew, Edinburgh would be destroyed. At 0636 hours, the German destroyers opened fire at 18,000 yards. Their 5 9-inch guns outranged Edinburgh's 6-inch guns and the British destroyers' 4.7-inch guns. The German destroyers closed to 15,000 yards and continued firing. Edinburgh returned fire despite being stationary. Her 6-inch guns fired at the German destroyers, but accuracy was poor without maneuver. The British destroyers, Foresight and Forester, charged the German destroyers attempting to close to torpedo range. The British destroyers were outnumbered and outgunned, but their aggression forced the German destroyers to maneuver defensively. At 06:48 hours, Forester launched torpedoes at Z-7 Hermann Schumann from 7,000 yards. The torpedoes missed, but forced Hermann Schumann to turn away. At 6:52 hours, Hermann Schumann was hit by gunfire from Edinburgh or one of the British destroyers. The shell hit Hermann Schumann's engine room, causing severe damage. Hermann Schumann slowed and began taking on water. She would eventually be scuttled by her crew. But at 06:58 hours, Z-24 fired torpedoes at Edinburgh from 8,000 yards. Edinburgh was stationary, unable to maneuver. The torpedoes tracked toward her. Faulkner could see the torpedo wakes approaching, but could do nothing. At 06:59 hours, 1 torpedo struck Edinburgh amidships on the port side. The explosion opened another massive hole in Edinburgh's hull, flooding the machinery spaces. All power was lost. All pumps stopped. Edinburgh began listing to port. The list increased rapidly as water flooded uncontrolled into the machinery spaces. Within 10 minutes, the list reached 20 degrees. Faulkner realized Edinburgh could not be saved. At 07:10 hours, he ordered abandon ship. The crew went over the side into the freezing Arctic water. Temperature was approximately 2 degrees Celsius. Survival time in that water was 15 to 30 minutes. The destroyers Foresight and Forester moved alongside Edinburgh and began rescuing survivors. Men climbed aboard the destroyers or were pulled from the water. By 7:45 hours, most of Edinburgh's crew had been evacuated. Faulkner remained aboard until the last man had left. Then he too abandoned ship. At 0800 hours, with Edinburgh's crew evacuated, Foresight was ordered to sink Edinburgh with torpedoes to prevent her capture by German forces. Foresight fired 1 torpedo into Edinburgh's hull. The explosion accelerated flooding. Edinburgh's list increased to 30 degrees. At 0835 hours, Edinburgh capsized to port and sank. She went down in position 72 degrees and 35 degrees 5 approximately 120 miles north of Murmansk in 800 feet of water. She took with her 4.5 tons of Soviet gold worth $45 million. 57 of Edinburgh's crew were killed, some by the initial torpedo hits, others by subsequent combat, some by exposure after abandoning ship. 806 crew members survived. The survivors were taken to Murmansk by the British destroyers, then eventually returned to Britain. The gold remained on the seafloor for 39 years. In 1954, the British government investigated salvaging the gold, but determined the operation was too expensive and technically difficult. In 1957, another investigation reached the same conclusion. In 1980, advances in salvage technology made recovery feasible. The British government contracted with a salvage company, Jessup Marine, to recover the gold. The salvage operation began in 1981. Divers located Edinburgh's wreck in 800 feet of water. Using side-scan sonar, the wreck was largely intact, lying on her port side. The salvage team used remotely operated vehicles and saturation divers to cut through Edinburgh's hull and access the forward magazine where the gold had been stored. The work was dangerous and technically complex. Divers worked at 800 feet, requiring decompression after each dive. The wreck was unstable. The hull was corroded. But the salvage team persevered. Between 1981 and 1986, the salvage team recovered 431 of the 465 gold ingots. The recovered gold weighed approximately 4.3 tons, worth approximately $100 million at 1986 prices. The gold was divided between the British government, the Soviet government, and the salvage company according to a pre-agreed formula. Britain received 45%. The Soviet Union received 45%. The salvage company received 10%. The 34 ingots that were not recovered had either been lost during the sinking, were buried under debris, or were inaccessible. The salvage operation demonstrated that deep-water salvage of valuable cargo was technically feasible and economically viable. The technical analysis of Edinburgh's sinking reveals how the lack of torpedo protection doomed her. The first two torpedoes from U-456 struck the bow and stern areas where Edinburgh had minimal subdivision and no torpedo protection. The explosions flooded large volumes because there were no void spaces or bulkheads to contain flooding. The bow and stern flooded almost immediately. The third torpedo from Z-24 struck amidships, an area that should have been better protected because it contained machinery spaces. But Edinburgh had no torpedo bulges, no crushable tubes, nothing to absorb the explosion. The torpedo exploded directly against the hull plating. The thin plating ruptured. Water flooded the machinery spaces directly. All power was lost. The ship was finished. The comparison with HMS Belfast, Edinburgh's sister ship, is instructive. Belfast had the same design vulnerability, no torpedo protection. In November 1939, Belfast struck a German magnetic mine that exploded beneath her keel, breaking her back. The damage was so severe that Belfast spent 3 years under repair. During those repairs, extensive modifications were made, including strengthening the hull and improving subdivision. But no torpedo bulges were added because the cost and time were prohibitive. Belfast survived the war through luck and careful tactics, avoiding torpedo attacks. Edinburgh was not as fortunate. She was hit by 3 torpedoes and sank because her design provided no protection against that threat. The comparison with American and Japanese cruisers reveals that other navies recognize the importance of torpedo protection. American Brooklyn-class cruisers, roughly comparable to the Town class, had internal torpedo protection systems consisting of multiple bulkheads and void spaces. They could typically survive 1 or 2 torpedo hits without sinking. Japanese Mogami-class cruisers had torpedo bulges that added approximately 500 tons to displacement but provided substantial protection. British cruiser design in the 1930s prioritized gun armament and speed over protection. This was a conscious trade-off based on the strategic calculation that cruisers would operate with destroyer screens. The calculation proved wrong in the Arctic convoys, where submarines could penetrate destroyer screens and attack escorts directly. The psychological analysis reveals the impact on crew morale. Edinburgh's crew knew their ship lacked torpedo protection. They had been torpedoed before in 1940 and seen how vulnerable the ship was. They knew that operating in the Arctic against German submarines was extremely dangerous. That knowledge created constant stress. Every sonar contact, every periscope sighting, every torpedo wake was potentially fatal. The crew could not do anything to improve the ship's protection. They simply had to accept the vulnerability and hope they were not hit. When they were hit on May 2, 1942, and saw how quickly the ship flooded, their fears were confirmed. The ship they had served on for years was fundamentally flawed. That realization was bitter. The strategic analysis reveals that losing $45 million in gold was significant, but not catastrophic for Britain. British gold reserves in 1942 totaled approximately $2 billion. Losing $45 million represented 2.25% of reserves. It was painful, but not crippling. Britain received additional gold shipments from the Soviet Union throughout the war that offset the loss. The greater loss was HMS Edinburgh herself. She was one of Britain's most modern cruisers experienced in Arctic operations needed for convoy escort. Replacing her was impossible. Britain was building new cruisers, but they would not enter service for years. Edinburgh's loss reduced the number of cruisers available for Arctic convoys, making subsequent convoys more vulnerable. The human cost was 57 crew members killed. These men died because their ship lacked adequate torpedo protection, a deficiency that had been identified during construction and deliberately accepted to save cost and construction time. The decision to proceed with the Town-class design despite the vulnerability was defensible from a resource allocation standpoint. Britain needed cruisers quickly. Adding torpedo protection would have delayed construction and increased costs. But that decision had consequences. Edinburgh's crew paid the price. The survivors carried the knowledge that their shipmates died because of a design flaw that could have been corrected. That knowledge created anger and bitterness that persisted for decades. The legacy of HMS Edinburgh is her demonstration that cost-saving measures in warship design can have fatal consequences. Edinburgh was a capable cruiser in most respects. Her guns were effective. Her engines were reliable. Her crew was well-trained. But she had one critical flaw: no torpedo protection. That flaw was identified during design. It was accepted as the price for rapid construction. It killed 57 men and sank the ship. The lesson is that warships must be designed for the threats they will actually face, not the threats designers prefer to focus on. Edinburgh was designed to fight other cruisers with guns. She faced submarines with torpedoes. She was not designed for that threat. She died from that threat. HMS Edinburgh, Town-class light cruiser, commissioned July 6, 1939, sunk May 2, 1942. Length 613 feet, displacement of 550 tons, armament 12 6-inch guns, top speed 32.5 knots. Fatal flaw: lack of underwater torpedo protection. Combat record: convoy escort duties in Atlantic and Arctic. Survived one torpedo hit in 1940, sunk by 3 torpedoes in 1942. Cargo at time of sinking: 4.5 tons of Soviet gold, worth $45 million recovered, 1981 to 1986. Casualties: 57 killed, 806 survived. The cruelest irony: Edinburgh was sunk while carrying a fortune in gold, but the gold could not save her. The fortune could not buy the torpedo protection that would have saved the ship. The design flaw that naval architects had identified in 1937 and the Admiralty had accepted to save money killed 57 men and sank a modern cruiser carrying a king's ransom. HMS Edinburgh lost due to a design flaw carrying gold to the bottom, testament to the principle that cutting corners in warship design has consequences measured in lives and millions. The cruiser that carried $45 million in gold, that had no torpedo protection, that was hit by 3 torpedoes, that sank in 800 feet of water, that was salvaged 39 years later. HMS Edinburgh, the cruelest irony. The ship that died because someone decided torpedo protection was too expensive. The 57 men who died with her would have disagreed.